On October 1st, 1987, 20-year-old Karina Mullen slid some file folders into a metal cabinet at the police station in the rural town of Central City, Kentucky. Karina glanced at her watch. It was the end of her workday, but she wanted to finish this filing before she left. She had only been working at the police station as an office assistant since she moved to Central City from her family farm about 6 weeks earlier. But in that short time, members of the small local police force had embraced her as one of their own, and she'd quickly become part of Central City's law enforcement family. Karina finished up her filing and took a few minutes to say goodbye to the officers on duty. It was Thursday, and she had off the next few days, so she told everyone to have a great weekend and said she'd see them soon. After that, she went outside to her car and drove through town towards the apartment she shared with her 2-year-old daughter and another young single mother who she'd quickly become friends with. Central City was only about 10 minutes from the farm Karina had grown up on, but to her, it felt like kind of a different world. Shops lined the main street, there were a few bars and restaurants in town, and it wasn't too far of a drive to a much bigger city with a thriving nightlife. Karina turned off the main street onto a side road, drove a little further, and then parked in front of her 2-bedroom apartment, which was one of several apartments in a small but crowded complex. Just 6 weeks ago, when she had moved here, this apartment felt like her first real taste of freedom. Now, Karina loved her parents and living on the family farm, but when she had turned 20 very recently, she really wanted to go out on her own, and she wanted to prove to her parents that she could raise her daughter by herself. But things had not quite turned out like she'd hoped. Karina was raising her child while working at the police station and studying to try to get into nursing school, and she just couldn't do it all. In truth, she missed having her mom and dad's help, and so, after only having been in this apartment for a little over a month, she had decided to move back to the farm. Karina stepped into her apartment and walked past the few moving boxes she'd already packed up. She saw her roommate, Angela Smith, getting something to eat in the kitchen. When Karina had dropped the news on Angela that she was leaving to go back to her farm, things had not gone well. Angela felt totally blindsided. She couldn't afford rent by herself, and she had no idea how quickly she could find a new roommate. But Karina had told her she wouldn't just disappear overnight. She would take her time moving out, and she'd try to help Angela get situated with rent before leaving, and so as a result, the tension had begun to ease between them. And this particular evening, the two women were less stressed than usual, because it was just them in the apartment. Karina's daughter was at the farm with Karina's parents, and Angela's ex had her daughter for the weekend. So Karina sat down with Angela in the kitchen, and they began chatting about work for a while. But at some point, Angela got a bit giddy and said she really just wanted to hear the latest gossip on Karina's boyfriend. Karina sighed and kind of laughed at herself. She'd recently broken up with her boyfriend, a guy named Jimmy Springer, who she'd had this on-again, off-again relationship with for 8 months. But almost in the same breath as talking about the most recent breakup with Jimmy, Karina told Angela that Jimmy was actually coming by later to spend the night. Karina knew this sounded sort of ridiculous, but even though she'd just cut Jimmy loose a few days earlier, she was looking forward to seeing him that night when her daughter was gone and they could just be alone together. At 9 a.m. the following morning, October 2nd, a city worker was driving to a job not far from the center of town when he noticed something that seemed totally out of place. Behind the parking garage used by the Central City Street Department, he saw an old 1977 Chevrolet car. This didn't make much sense because people from town normally never parked over here, and he knew this car didn't belong to anyone who worked for the street department. The worker parked his truck and hopped out. He wanted to make sure there wasn't someone in the car who might need help or something. He walked towards the car, and at first he didn't see anybody inside. But when he was just a few feet away, he got a good look at the trunk. And without thinking, the worker turned around, ran to the nearest open shop, asked to use the phone, and called 911. Minutes later, Lieutenant Billy Fields of the Central City Police Department arrived at the scene with several other local police officers. Fields got out of his car. He was in his mid-40s and was one of the most experienced cops on the force. He saw the parked 1977 Chevrolet, and from where he was standing, it was clear there were bloodstains on the outside of the trunk. When the other cops looked at Fields and then over at the car he had just stared at, it hit them why he was so upset. They all recognized the Chevy. It belonged to their coworker and friend, Karina Mullen. Fields walked closer to the car, and he saw blood smears that went into the trunk, like whoever had been bleeding might actually be in the trunk. Lieutenant Fields noticed the trunk was not actually closed all the way, so he reached down and opened it, and as soon as he did, he shouted and just turned away. The other officers walked over to him and saw what he was looking at, and when they did, they all looked away too. They had just seen their friend, Karina, laying in the trunk, and she was obviously deceased. She was naked, covered in dried blood, with cuts on her hands and neck. Her nose had been smashed in, and there were dark bruises covering most of her body. Fields and the other officers did their best to collect themselves. This was a small-town police force that dealt mainly with petty theft and domestic disputes. They occasionally had to tackle larger drug-related crimes in the area, but none of them had dealt with anything like this. Not to mention the victim was somebody they all knew and cared about. Fields told them he knew how upsetting this was, but they still had a job to do. So he and a couple of officers turned back to the trunk and did a more thorough search, while others opened the car and looked inside. Fields found a bloody comforter from a bed stuffed into the trunk next to Karina's body, along with jeans and a pair of women's underwear. There was a lot of blood in the trunk, but Fields said there would be a lot more if she was actually killed in the trunk or in the car, versus being killed elsewhere and then moved to the car. The officers who had searched the rest of the car said they did find a few small bloodstains, but nothing that would indicate the attack had actually taken place inside the vehicle. So as a result, Lieutenant Fields and the others began to think that Karina must have been murdered somewhere else and then thrown into her trunk and dumped here. The bloody comforter could have been used to carry her from the murder scene to the car, and it only made sense that that comforter would have come from a bedroom. Later that day, after Karina's body had been removed from the trunk and the clothes and the bloody comforter had been bagged as evidence, Lieutenant Fields knocked on the front door of Karina's apartment. A young detective and several uniformed officers stood behind him. Karina's roommate, Angela, opened the door. Even though it was the afternoon, she looked like she'd either just rolled out of bed or hadn't slept all night. Angela had met most of these officers before, and she knew they worked with Karina, and so she asked them if they needed Karina for something work-related. But Fields didn't waste any time. He bluntly told Angela that Karina was dead and the police needed to search the apartment. Angela backed away from the door, either too shocked or too scared to say anything. Fields told her to wait right there, and then he and the other officers stepped inside, and immediately they felt like they had found the murder scene. There was no sign of forced entry at the door, but they could clearly see bloodstains on the carpet. They followed the bloodstains down a short hallway to a closed door. Fields opened it, and when he and the others stepped inside, they knew this had to be Karina's bedroom. They saw photos of her, her parents, and her little girl. But they also saw a scene of complete horror. Blood spatter covered the wall above the bed, and the sheets looked like they had been soaked in blood. The officers also saw there was no comforter on the bed. There was no question this had to be where Karina had been killed. And so Fields sent the uniformed officers to canvass the apartment complex. The units were all close together, and the walls looked pretty thin. He thought somebody must have heard a violent attack last night. Fields and the young detective walked back through the apartment, and Fields barked at Angela to join them in the kitchen. Fields was usually a pretty easygoing guy, very calm on the job, but this case had already put him on edge. Fields and the detective sat down with Angela at the kitchen table, and Fields asked her when she had last seen Karina. Angela told him that they had both gone out to a club last night, since neither of their daughters were home, and they'd gotten back at around maybe midnight. They'd been drinking pretty heavily, so they both went to bed not long after that. Fields snapped right back. He didn't care how much she'd been drinking. This was a small apartment, and the two bedrooms shared a wall. There was no way Angela didn't hear what happened in Karina's room, and there was no way she didn't see the bloodstains on the carpet when she woke up. Angela hung her head and fought back tears, and as she did, Fields asked her if she was hiding something from them. She stayed silent for a second, and then nodded. She said she hadn't just been drinking the night before. She'd also taken a bunch of painkillers and totally blacked out. She said she was just kind of starting to feel normal again, and so that's why she hadn't heard anything the night before or noticed the bloodstains when she finally woke up. Lieutenant Fields took a breath and eased off a bit. He'd worked enough drug cases in the area to know that the right combination of booze and pills could basically make someone seem dead to the world for a while. This meant there was a chance Angela was actually telling the truth, that she really had no idea what happened over the last 10-12 hours. Fields and the young detective gave Angela a minute to collect herself. Then the young detective asked if there was anyone she could think of in Karina's life who might have wanted to hurt her. Angela said there was one obvious choice: Karina's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Jimmy Springer. Fields and the detective looked at each other. They didn't know a ton about Karina's boyfriend, but they'd heard enough from her at work to know her relationship had its share of drama. Fields asked if Angela knew the last time Karina had seen Jimmy. Karina closed her eyes and tried to fight back tears. She said last night, before Karina went to bed, she had told her to keep the front door unlocked, because Jimmy was coming over late and he was going to be spending the night. After leaving the apartment, Lieutenant Fields caught up with the uniformed officers who'd canvassed the area, and they told him that nobody had heard anything strange last night. This made no sense. The complex was small and the walls looked thin. How had nobody heard anything? Fields said he would try to figure that out later. He told the young detective to go track Jimmy down and call him in for an interview. In the meantime, Fields would have to drive out to Karina's family farm. News of a violent crime like this in such a small town would spread fast, and he did not want Karina's parents to find out that their daughter had been murdered from the TV. That afternoon, Fields sat down with Karina's parents in a large open room with high ceilings in their farmhouse, and he told them the news. Karina's mother broke down immediately, but her father just stared off into space, almost like his mind had gone completely blank. All Fields could do was tell them how sorry he was and how he would do everything in his power to find her killer. He told them that Karina was part of the family at the police department, and nobody would get away with doing this to her. Fields told the parents that he didn't want to intrude on their grief, but he wondered if they knew anything about Karina's latest boyfriend, Jimmy Springer. Karina's mom forced herself to stop crying for a second, and she got an angry look on her face. She said Jimmy was no good for her little girl. He was jealous all the time and he had a bad temper. Karina's dad quickly added that this was not just typical jealous boyfriend stuff that might be expected from a young man. He told Lieutenant Fields that a few weeks earlier, Karina had come to the farmhouse and her face was all red. When he asked her what had happened, she told him that Jimmy had grabbed her, dragged her into the bathroom, and rubbed off all of her makeup with a washcloth because he didn't like her wearing makeup when she was out. Fields assured the parents that the police were already working to bring Jimmy in for questioning. He said he would update them about the case as quickly and as often as he could. He told them again how sorry he was, then said goodbye and walked back outside to his car. On the night of October 2nd, so a little over 12 hours after Karina's body had been found, Lieutenant Fields sat with the Central City Chief of Police and the county sheriff in an interview room at the sheriff's department. Fields had been right, and the story of Karina's murder had already made the nightly news in cities all over the area. This was by far the biggest crime to have hit Central City in recent memory. So the chief and the sheriff wanted to make sure they handled everything by the book and that they could control the story in the media as much as possible. Just then, a deputy led Jimmy Springer into the room. Jimmy was 19 years old, tall and skinny, and he wore jeans and a t-shirt. He currently lived a little less than 2 hours away in Nashville, Tennessee, but police had found him staying with a friend in Central City. Jimmy sat down, and right away the sheriff asked him if he knew why he was there. Jimmy had already heard about Karina, so he responded by saying he had nothing to do with her death. The police chief asked Jimmy where he'd been the night before, and Jimmy said he'd gone to a local bar with a couple of friends just to have a few beers. Afterward, he swung by Karina's apartment, but when he knocked on the door, nobody answered, so he headed to his friend's house and crashed there for the night. The chief didn't hold back. He told Jimmy he thought he was lying. Karina's roommate had told police she left the door unlocked for Jimmy, so why didn't he just walk in? Jimmy sat there for a second and began to shift in his seat uncomfortably, but he stuck to his story. The investigators kept pushing, but Jimmy didn't budge. He just kept saying he had nothing to do with Karina's murder. Now, despite the fact that everybody in that room thought Jimmy was not telling them everything, the chief and the sheriff recognized that they didn't really have any clear evidence tying Jimmy to the murder yet, so they let him go. This decision baffled Lieutenant Fields. He argued that they were just letting Karina's killer walk out the door. On October 5th, 3 days after Karina's body was found, Fields sat at his desk, reading over the medical examiner's autopsy report. The report did not surprise Fields, based on what he already knew about the case. Karina had been cut several times with a blade and had been beaten badly with a blunt object. She'd also been raped before she was killed. The medical examiner believed that this had all taken place the night before Karina's body had been found in the trunk of her car. Lieutenant Fields believed this autopsy report made Jimmy look even more guilty. The violence inflicted on Karina showed the kind of rage that police often saw in cases involving jealous boyfriends and husbands. But Fields had been told he couldn't go after Jimmy yet, so he had to be patient. The comforter, clothing, and other pieces of evidence found in the trunk of Karina's car and at her apartment had already been sent off to the state crime lab for testing. And Fields knew that those test results might help police close the case whenever they came in. While Fields read over the autopsy report again, an officer approached his desk and told him he'd just come across something important that had somehow gone overlooked. On the day before Karina's murder, a young man had called into the station saying he witnessed someone threatening Karina with a gun. And this alleged gunman was somebody the police in town knew all too well. His name was Jeffrey Lee Boyd, and he was the biggest drug dealer in Central City. The fact that this had gone overlooked didn't actually come as a shock or anything to Fields. This was a small police force with limited resources, and as soon as Karina's body had been found, everything else had sort of gotten pushed aside. Fields knew Jeffrey Lee Boyd well enough to know that he and his crew of drug dealers were very dangerous, and so Fields didn't want to just go after Jeffrey on potential murder charges unless he really had to. So he asked this officer to go find the witness and tell them to come down to the station. A little later that day, Fields met with this witness. But after only a few minutes of questioning, the young man's story began to fall apart. He went from accusing Jeffrey of sticking a gun in Karina's face to saying he actually wasn't positive Jeffrey had a gun at all, to admitting he hadn't even gotten a clear look at the man with Karina, so he couldn't even guarantee that it was Jeffrey. After the interview, Fields told his team it had felt like a big waste of time speaking to this witness. Jeffrey was definitely a known drug dealer and he'd done prison time in the past, but that didn't automatically mean he was Karina's killer. And if the police chief felt like they didn't have enough evidence to go after Karina's boyfriend Jimmy, then there was no way he was going to have them pursue a lead based on an eyewitness account that was flimsy at best. So, a few days into the investigation, the team already felt like they were treading water. And at the same time, Fields began receiving regular phone calls from Karina's dad, who was desperate for any updates. But Fields just kept apologizing and saying he had nothing new to report. On October 28th, so almost a month after Karina's murder, the police chief called Lieutenant Fields into his office and told him he had some big news. He'd just gotten a call from police in Nashville, Tennessee, and they'd picked up Karina's boyfriend Jimmy for stealing a computer from his work. They were currently holding him on grand larceny charges, but Jimmy had been talking a lot about the murder in Central City, and so they wanted the chief to know. And now the chief and the sheriff were going to Nashville to question Jimmy again. Fields felt a rush of excitement. He said he knew they didn't have any test results from the lab yet, but he was sure Jimmy was their guy. That night, Fields paced back and forth in the police station, anxiously waiting for any news. Most of the other officers waited with him. There was the sense that the chief's trip to Nashville was going to help bring this case to a close and finally get justice for their friend Karina. Finally, late that night, Fields' phone rang. He grabbed it and he heard the chief's voice on the other end. And the chief said Fields was not going to believe what had just gone down in Nashville. Jimmy had not confessed to the murder, but he had admitted to going into Karina's apartment that night. Fields knew this was a huge deal, It meant Jimmy had flat out lied to the police the first time he spoke to them. But the chief said there was something way bigger than that. Jimmy said he had gone to Karina's bedroom and seen blood, but instead of calling the police, he had driven around town looking for Karina himself, and when he didn't find her, he just went to his friend's house and fell asleep. This had to be one of the most unbelievable, ridiculous alibis the chief or Fields had ever heard in their law enforcement careers. And so a few minutes later, when Fields hung up the phone, he felt this huge sense of relief. The chief and the sheriff were ready to put together a case against Jimmy, because they too now believed he was the killer. On July 19, 1988, so 9 months after Karina's body had been found, her boyfriend, Jimmy, went on trial for her murder. Some officers who worked in the state crime lab felt like this case had actually been rushed to trial, because when the lab had finally tested evidence from the case, the results had not tied Jimmy directly to the murder scene. So the case against Jimmy was based entirely on circumstantial evidence. But Fields and other members of the Central City Police believed their case against Jimmy was still strong, and they expected a conviction. After a couple of days, the trial ended, and the jury deliberated for only an hour. Fields sat in the courtroom feeling a rush of anticipation as the jury foreman read the verdict, and Fields heard the words, "Not guilty." Fields felt like he had just gotten the wind completely knocked out of him. He'd spent a huge part of almost a year doing everything he could to ensure that Jimmy would go to prison for killing Karina. Now, any hope of that was gone. The police officers filed out of the courtroom feeling utterly defeated and like they had failed their friend and her family. And with 9 months of work basically erased, they had no idea where to restart the investigation. During the weeks following Jimmy's trial, Lieutenant Fields felt like he was scrambling. But he and his team did decide to revisit the possibility that the killer could be Jeffrey Lee Boyd, that drug dealer who may or may not have threatened Karina with a gun. And this time, when they looked into it, they discovered something new about Jeffrey. He was close friends, and maybe even lovers, with Karina's roommate, Angela. The team immediately went back to their early notes from the case, and they quickly found something else they had missed. The medical examiner's toxicology report made it clear that no alcohol or drugs were present in Karina's body when she was killed. But Angela had told Fields and the other detective that she and Karina had been drinking heavily the night of the murder. Fields said he was frustrated with himself. These oversights could be chalked up to a small team handling a case that might be too big for them, but he apologized for what he saw as a massive misstep on his part. Still, they now had a clear connection between the drug dealer, Jeffrey, and the victim, and they now believed the victim's roommate had lied to them. So, in August of 1988, 10 months after the murder, Fields brought in Angela for another interview. But all she could say was that, maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe she only thought Karina was drinking a bunch when they went out, because she herself had been really drunk and on painkillers. Following his talk with Angela, Lieutenant Fields tracked down 25-year-old Jeffrey at his house, and he happened to be there with an 18-year-old drug dealer named Kramer, who cops believed worked for Jeffrey. The two dealers made an odd-looking pair. Jeffrey was this tall, massive guy who had no problem physically intimidating people, while Kramer was skinny and barely stood 5 feet tall. Fields talked to them for a while at the house, but when he got back to the station, he told the chief that both young men had barely said a thing. This seemed par for the course, though, because Jeffrey, who had been questioned many times in the past by police, sort of knew to keep his mouth shut. Even though Jeffrey had started to seem like a strong suspect on the surface, as the investigation went on, Fields was not able to produce enough evidence to convince anyone that they had a case against Jeffrey. And once Jeffrey fell off the radar, the investigation began to dry up. In fact, as brokenhearted as police officers and the people who knew Karina still were, there seemed to be an effort from everybody to just move on. Like the only way for the town to heal was to put this horrific murder case behind them, despite it being unsolved. And so as months and then years went by, there were only 2 men who seemed to still be actively looking for Karina's murderer. That was her father and Lieutenant Fields. Sometimes, Fields would even pick up Karina's dad at the farm, and they would just drive around together, looking for any potential clue that they might have missed. But those clues never surfaced, and the years kept passing by. Eventually, Lieutenant Fields retired from the force, and then once Fields was gone, Karina's dad convinced the state police to pick up the investigation. And they tried for a time to solve the murder, but eventually, they also let the case go. Finally, after over a decade of searching, Karina's mom convinced her husband that he needed to drop the case too. They could not spend the rest of their lives hunting for a killer that nobody could find. That is not what Karina would have wanted for them. In June of 2006, over 18 years after Karina's murder, Detective Damon Fleming of the Kentucky State Police sat at his desk digging through old notebooks and file folders. The state police had recently made an effort to revitalize cold cases, and Detective Fleming had been assigned to Karina's murder investigation. Fleming knew the case had long since disappeared from public consciousness, but when he took it over, he had gotten the word out to the media in and around Central City that the investigation had been reopened. And if anybody had information, no matter how insignificant they thought it might be, they should contact the state police. Sitting at his desk, Fleming heard someone call his name. He looked up from the notebook he was reading, and he saw an officer there with this woman who appeared to be in her 30s, and she looked absolutely terrified. Detective Fleming asked what he could do for her, and she said she needed to talk to him in private. Fleming stood up, signaled for the other officer to leave, and then he led the woman into a conference room. He closed the door behind them, and then sat down across from her at a long wooden conference table. As soon as she sat down, the woman kept glancing over her shoulder like she thought somebody was following her. But Fleming assured her they were totally safe in here, and he asked her why she needed to see him. Tears began running down the woman's cheeks as she cleared her throat, and then she told him her name was Samantha Robinson, and that when she was 16 years old, she had witnessed the brutal murder of Karina Mullen. Detective Fleming sat there, silent and almost in awe of this woman, and by the time she stopped talking, he knew that she had given him all of the information he would need to finally close Karina's murder case after almost 20 years. Based on Samantha's story and evidence and interviews from multiple investigations conducted over 18 years, this is what police believe happened to Karina on the night of October 1st, 1987. On that night, 16-year-old Samantha Robinson was walking down the middle of a street in Capital City, Kentucky towards her house when she heard a car behind her. Samantha turned and saw headlights rapidly approaching, so she hopped up onto the sidewalk to get out of the way. Suddenly, the car came to a screeching halt right alongside her. The driver's door and the front passenger door flew open, and two men came out and rushed towards her. The driver grabbed Samantha and she kicked and screamed, but there was no way she could get out of his grip. The passenger opened up one of the back doors, and the driver shoved Samantha into the back seat and then slammed the door shut behind her. Samantha looked next to her, and there was the group's leader, sitting in the back seat, smiling at her. The car lurched forward, and a few minutes later, it pulled up to Karina's apartment. The back door of the car opened, and the driver and passenger grabbed Samantha and pulled her out of the car and up towards the apartment, while their leader followed behind, holding a metal club in one of their hands. The driver opened the door to Karina's apartment and told Samantha to keep her mouth shut if she wanted to live. The leader walked past them and right to Karina's bedroom, where Karina was sleeping. The driver and passenger followed with Samantha and then threw Samantha to the bedroom floor. Karina woke up and saw all the people in her room and began to scream, but the leader jumped on top of her and began beating her stomach with the metal club until she went quiet. At this point, the leader climbed off of Karina, off the bed, and motioned to the driver. This man drew a knife from his hip, climbed onto the bed with Karina, and made shallow cuts into Karina's neck, arms, and stomach. After that, the driver, with the knife, and then the passenger, and then the leader, all raped Karina. Afterwards, they stepped away from the bed, and for a second, Samantha, who was on the ground, hoped and prayed they would just leave. But the leader raised the metal club, rushed back to the bed, and smashed Karina in the head and nose with it. Karina's nose broke, blood sprayed all over the wall and ran into the sheets, and Karina began to choke. at which point the group just stood there and watched her die. After Karina was dead, the leader told the other two to wrap Karina up in her comforter. They followed the orders and carried Karina in her comforter out of the apartment. The leader picked up Karina's car keys off the bedside table, then yanked Samantha up off the floor and dragged her outside. The leader opened up the trunk of Karina's '77 Chevrolet that was parked out front and told the others to dump Karina inside of it. Then the leader handed the car keys to Samantha and told her if she drove them to the parking garage near the center of town, they might let her live. Shaking and terrified, Samantha did as she was told. She climbed into the driver's seat with the killers and drove them to a spot behind the parking garage in town and parked the car. And then in a flash, this teenage girl killed the engine, took the keys out of the ignition, leapt out of the car, and threw the keys as far away as she could. By the time the killers knew what had happened, Samantha was already running through the shadows and making her way home. The leader sat in the car for a second and just started laughing. They said there was no way this little girl would ever rat them out. She would spend the rest of her life in constant fear that if she did, they would find her and kill her. And so all three of the killers got out of Karina's car and walked through town, covered in blood. The driver and the passenger went their own way, and the leader walked home, showered, and went to bed. The following morning, the killer's leader got dressed, grabbed their badge and gun, and headed to their place of work, the police station. The drug dealer, Jeffrey Lee Boyd, and his 18-year-old friend Kramer helped carry out Karina's murder. But their leader, the one who was in charge of the murder, also happened to become the lead investigator on Karina's murder, Lieutenant Billy Fields. It would turn out Lieutenant Fields was at the top of the drug trade in Central City, giving out orders and providing police cover while Jeffrey ran things on the street. But Jeffrey just couldn't keep quiet. One day, while he was hanging out with Karina's roommate, Angela, he let it slip that he had cops working with him and protecting him, and Karina heard all of this. Jeffrey quickly realized he'd made a huge mistake, so the day before the murder, he got his gun and threatened to kill Karina if she talked, just like the witness described seeing. But Fields thought that was not enough. The only way to be sure they would not get caught was to kill her. Fields and Jeffrey were sadistic, though. Murder wasn't enough for them. So when they were driving to Karina's and saw that teenager Samantha on the street, they decided to grab her and make her watch what happened next. And what happened next is they raped and killed Karina and forced Kramer to participate. But Karina's roommate Angela had been in her bedroom and heard everything that night. But they threatened to kill her if she talked. Jeffrey came up with the story about Angela and Karina going out and drinking and taking pills for Angela to tell the police. Fields also told Jeffrey to threaten everybody who lived in that apartment complex. That's why when they were asked by police, all those neighbors said they didn't hear anything. After that, Fields made sure to personally overlook whatever needed to be overlooked in the investigation in order to steer it away from him and his partners. Karina's boyfriend Jimmy almost turned out to be the perfect patsy for Fields. But in court, Jimmy's lawyers argued that police had bullied and manipulated him into saying things that were not true, and so he was acquitted. And after Jimmy was found not guilty, Lieutenant Fields led the investigation into his own accomplices, but he made sure to steal evidence from the police station to make sure his accomplices didn't actually look guilty, so eventually the case went cold. It would take almost 20 years for Samantha to finally get over her fear of Fields and Jeffrey. When she heard the case had been reopened, she went straight to the state police and told them everything. She said she owed it to Karina. Angela ultimately aided the prosecution and was only charged with perjury. She did not serve any jail time. As for the killers, Kramer was sentenced to 60 years in prison, and Jeffrey and Lieutenant Billy Fields were sentenced to life. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. April 15th, 2018, A 56-year-old woman named Yoshika Yasutake began dusting a piano inside of her family's very small and very clean home in the English village of Helmsley. Like she always did, after dusting the outside of this piano, Yoshika lifted up the lid and began individually dusting each of the piano keys. But as she did this, she was very careful not to press down accidentally on any of the keys and make a sound. That was the last thing she wanted to do. Every time Yoshika was in charge of cleaning the house, she always dreaded getting to the piano because she was so worried about making a sound. After Yoshika had finished dusting this piano, both outside and inside, she lowered the lid and then walked over to a bookcase right next to a window and began dusting each of the books. And as she did, she began to hear out the window the sounds of birds chirping and cars driving around and people chatting. And Yoshika, when she heard this, she stopped dusting for a moment and just looked out the window at the beautiful town, all the little stone cottages that lined the road. And as she looked out there and listened to the sounds of her village, Yoshika was struck with a sadness about all the things that she was missing out on. Once, Yoshika had been a world-class pianist. She had trained at the Royal College of Music, which is one of the most prestigious institutions in London, and she used to play packed symphony halls where sometimes in the audience would be literal members of the royal family. I mean, she was a really big deal. But Yoshika didn't play the piano anymore because her younger sister, Rina, had come back home. Now, as soon as Yoshika thought of Rina, she got angry and instinctively just turned and stared at Rina's closed bedroom door. And just for a moment, Yoshika wished that Rina had not come home. Because ever since Rina had come home, it was like all of Yoshika's family had decided that nothing else was important. Rina was the only thing that mattered. The Yasutake family consisted of Yoshika, as well as, of course, Rina, who was 49 years old, and they both had a brother who was 51 years old, and his name was Takahiro, and the three siblings' mother also lived with them, and she was 80 years old. As for their dad, he had passed away a few years earlier. Yoshika and Takahiro were both very impressive in their own ways. Yoshika had been this amazing pianist, and Takahiro was this amazing writer, but Rina was just on another level. Rina not only spoke fluent Greek, Latin, English, and Japanese, but she also created her own dialect of Japanese with a complete system of grammar. Rina was also this unbelievable artist, and everybody wanted to buy her paintings, but Rina would never sell, or if she did, it was quite rare, but that only created lots of hype around her artwork. It was like so valuable to get your hands on one of Rina's paintings. As a child, Rina had been awarded all these scholarships to all these prestigious private schools, and then after graduating high school, she was given a full-ride scholarship to the University of Cambridge, which is one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And so everybody assumed Rina was on track to become this world-famous artist. But there was something dark inside of Rina that no one could quite place. It only came out when she would have these sudden outbursts of anger, and people would see this side of her that just didn't line up with the rest of who she was. But these flashes of anger would often pass quickly, and so people kind of wrote it off as a byproduct of extreme genius. It was like her brain just sometimes couldn't quite handle how smart she was, and she would get mad and frustrated. But when Rina graduated from the University of Cambridge and came back home, she just was totally different. It was like something inside of her had snapped and stayed broken. A couple of days after Rina had come home, she had one of those sudden outbursts of anger, but Rina's anger never went away. She just stayed mad for days and days, and her family began asking her, like, what has gotten you so upset? But Rina refused to talk about it. And eventually, Rina just locked herself in her bedroom in the family home, and she would stay inside of there, refusing to talk to her family for weeks. And then when she did finally emerge after several weeks, it was clear Rina was just different. She basically refused to speak to anyone, family included, unless it was absolutely necessary, and she really never left the house or even her room unless it was totally necessary. And it would turn out this was not some post-college phase Rina was going through. This would become Rina's life. She basically became a total recluse inside of that bedroom for decades, to the point where the family's neighbors didn't even know Rina existed because she basically never came out of the house. Yoshika stopped staring at her sister's closed bedroom door and turned her attention back to the books on the shelf. She finished dusting them, and then after she was done cleaning the house, and so she put the duster down, and Yoshika very quietly tiptoed her way over to Rina's closed bedroom door, and very quietly she knocked. Rina hated loud noises, which is why Yoshika was no longer allowed to play the piano, because it was too loud for Rina. After Yoshika gave this light knock, she began counting in her head to 30, because Rina had told her, you do not come in right away. You knock, and you wait 30 seconds at least, and then maybe I'll let you come inside. And so Yoshika, she's counting in her head, 1, 2, 3, she gets to 25, 26, 27, and then from inside the room, Rina would tell Yoshika, okay, you're allowed to enter. Yoshika very slowly reached down, she turned the knob and opened up her sister's bedroom door, and it revealed this totally dark room, this very small, cramped space. All the shades and blinds had been drawn, and Rina was sitting on her bed, completely silent. And Yoshika, she kept her head down, being very careful not to make eye contact with Rina. She didn't want to upset her. And Yoshika, she walked into the room, she made her way to the table, and she scooped up all of Rina's dirty dishes. And then Yoshika, she turned around and began walking out again. And as she did, she tried to take a quick glimpse at whatever Rina was working on in her bedroom, because Rina had told her family that she was working on this master work, but wouldn't really elaborate on it. And in order to work on this thing, she needed the room to be dark and the house to be silent, and she needed to focus exclusively on this master work, and the family needed to support her as she did this. But again, Rina just never really elaborated on what this masterwork was. She would just say that it was very special, and it would combine all the elements of her life, her spirit, her body, her soul. Even the family would be a part of building this masterwork. And when her family asked her, well, what do you mean? How can we support you in making this masterwork? Rina would just say, oh, you'll know when the time is right. Yoshika couldn't get a glimpse of the masterwork, and so she quickly turned her head back down to the ground and shuffled her way out of Rina's room and shut the door behind her. And then Yoshika, she went to the kitchen and she dumped Rina's dishes in the sink, which was totally clean to begin with, because one of Rina's rules was the house must always be immaculately clean, no dirty dish, no dust anywhere. I mean, it had to be perfect, spotless at all times, because that's the only way Rina could work on this master work. And so as Yoshika cleaned and dried off all of Rina's dishes and began putting them away, her brother Takahiro walked into the kitchen, and he would say to Yoshika that it was time for them to leave the house and go to the market and buy some supplies for Rina so she can continue to work on this master work. Yoshika was immediately totally annoyed that they had to go do this, because everything was all about Rina, but she kind of buried those feelings and told her brother, okay, sure, let's go. Takahiro was different than Yoshika in how he thought about their younger sister, Rina. Yoshika totally resented Rina because now that Rina was home, Yoshika basically had to give up her career as this amazing pianist in order to support Rina in this whole master work she was working on. But Takahiro, he was totally fine giving up his writing career to just focus on supporting Rina, because he really believed in Rina, and he thought that this master work she was building was going to be like the single greatest piece of art in the history of humankind. And so Takahiro felt proud to kind of be a part of it. Now, Takahiro, like the rest of his family, had no idea what this master work actually was, but Takahiro and Rina had a much better relationship than Yoshika and Rina, and so Rina would tell Takahiro the specific things that she needed in order to build this master work. And so that day, Rina had told Takahiro some things she needed, and so he and Yoshika were going to go out and get them. So Takahiro and Yoshika threw on their jackets and stepped outside, and as soon as they were out there, they both flipped their collars up and kind of concealed their faces and put their heads down because they were very careful not to make eye contact with other people. This family was already very private, but with Rina, they had been instructed to be even more private and not even really interact with the outside world. And so basically, anytime they went out in public, they would kind of hide themselves. And so Yoshika and Takahiro, they made their way to the pharmacy, they ducked their way inside, and they would purchase a bottle of surgical spirits, which is sort of like a medical alcohol. And then after buying that, the brother and sister put their collars back up, headed back outside, and they went to an old used bookstore, and they bought a book on palm reading, which is the art of studying the lines on your hands in order to tell someone's future. And when the brother and sister bought this book, even though the cashier was talking to them, they kept their heads down and didn't say a word to the cashier. And then after getting their book, the brother and sister hurried their way back home. And when they got there, the door was locked. But instead of pulling out a key and unlocking the door of their own home, the brother and sister knocked and they waited. And then at some point, their mother came to the door and they heard 4 locks turning. The door opened up. And then Yoshika and Takahiro walked inside and they shut the door and then locked again the 4 deadbolts. Rina was adamant that no one in the family could carry around a key to the house. It was too dangerous because they could potentially lose the key in town, and then someone could come into their house and potentially see Rina's master work, and they couldn't have that happen. And so nobody had keys. They had to knock each time they came home. And the reason they had 4 locks on the door was, again, because Rina was very worried about somebody coming into this house and seeing what she was doing. Yoshika carried the bag with the supplies inside of it, the surgical spirits and the palm reading book, over to Rina's closed bedroom door. And instead of knocking, Yoshika just placed the bag right outside the door. She turned around and began walking away. And then as she did, she heard the sound of Rina's door opening just a crack. And Yoshika, she quickly turned around and she saw a tiny skinny arm reach out from behind the door. It grabbed the bag and then pulled the bag back into the room, and the door shut and locked. Three days later, on April 18th, 2018, Yoshika was sitting in the kitchen reading a book when she overheard her brother, Takahiro, chatting with Rina. Now, Takahiro and Rina were not facing each other in the same room talking. Rina was still in her bedroom, her door was closed, and Takahiro was outside of her bedroom, and he was just sitting on the ground with his back to the door, talking through the door to Rina. Now, this was not unusual because unlike Yoshika and Rina, who did not have a good relationship and who really didn't talk at all, Takahiro and Rina did have a good relationship, and they would do this fairly often. They would chat through the door for like hours at a time. And so for a minute, Yoshika kind of ignored her brother and sister chatting and focused again on her book. But at some point, she began hearing what her brother was saying, and it was just totally weird. And so she put her book down and just began listening to Takahiro. And what he was saying was, how can you do that? That doesn't make any sense. How? Only your soul? How? Yoshika sensed that her brother was confused and maybe upset about something, and so she couldn't help herself. She put her book down, and Yoshika walked out to the living room and looked down at her brother to see if he would kind of give her some indication of what was going on. But when Takahiro looked up and saw Yoshika, he and Rina stopped talking, and Takahiro just shook his head, stood up, and walked away. After Takahiro was gone, Yoshika very quietly walked over to Rina's bedroom door, and just out of curiosity, she pressed her ear up against the wood and tried to listen to see if she could maybe hear Rina and catch something she was saying that would begin to explain what she had just overheard. But all she heard was the sound of Rina slowly shuffling towards the back of her bedroom where her bed was, and then it was totally silent. And so Yoshika moved away from the door and went back into the kitchen, and she sat down to read again, but she couldn't focus on the book because it was like this wave of sadness was just coming over her. And the reason Yoshika was feeling this way is she was thinking about the fact that back in the day when she was a kid, her and Rina used to be as close as sisters could possibly be, and for much of their lives, they were very close. Even after Rina began this kind of reclusive lifestyle, they still, were friends. They interacted. But something happened in 2013, 5 years earlier, that totally severed their relationship for good. On that day, Rina had emerged from her bedroom, and Yoshika offered to read Rina's palm. This was something the two sisters did for each other periodically. It was like a way for them to bond. And so Rina held out her hand, and Yoshika took it, and she began tracing a long horizontal line across her palm. Now, Rina's hands were different than most people's hands. Rina had something called a simian line, which is a very rare thing on people's palms. It's like this long horizontal line that runs the length of your hand. In palm reading, a simian line can be either very good or very bad. It can indicate that the person is a visionary or a mystic, so that's the good side, or it can indicate that this person has a terrible disease or they're very aggressive, so that's the bad side. Rina knew she had the simian line, and she believed that it represented something good. She would say that she had a visionary soul. But on this particular day in 2013, the family had recently been banned from a local supermarket because Rena had actually gone to this market and gotten really upset with some staff members and totally lost her cool and screamed and yelled at them, and so they had been banned. And so Yoshika, thinking about this, she's looking at Rena's palm and she goes, "Oh, the simian line. Maybe this is why you were acting so aggressive at the supermarket. Maybe this means you're an aggressive person." But after Yoshika said this, Rena was so offended that she whipped her hand back and began screaming and yelling at Yoshika, calling her an idiot and saying, "You don't understand the vision that I have. I'm going to show the world someday this vision, and you and those idiots down at the grocery store would never understand." And then Rena began beating and punching and kicking Yoshika, and Yoshika's screaming and trying to protect herself. And then Takahiro, the brother, had to run in and separate the two of them. Now, even though Rena was prone to these angry outbursts, this was the first time that she had lashed out physically, and so Rena's mother was concerned that Rena had some underlying condition that was causing her to lash out physically, and so she sent Rena to the doctor. And the doctor would say, there is no underlying condition that led to this. However, it seems pretty clear that Rena is having some kind of psychological breakdown and needs psychiatric treatment, maybe even hospitalization. But Rena had totally rejected this, refused to get treatment, and blamed everything on Yoshika. And then after that, Rena really stopped leaving her bedroom. She left like once every couple of months before that, but now she basically stayed in there 24/7. And at the same time, Rena had added all these new rules that her family now needed to follow to allow Rena to be able to focus on her master work while she was in her bedroom. And that included no one having house keys and adding those 4 locks to the door. Also, the family was told to learn the new dialect of Japanese that Rena had created. This way, no one would ever understand what they were talking about. It would kind of protect them even more from the evils of the outside world. Also, Rena made sure her family got rid of all of their telephones, their TVs, and their computers. And so Yoshika would sit in the kitchen for a bit longer, thinking about how sad it was that she had lost this relationship with her sister. And, Yoshika had a lot of regret about what she had said about the simian line. But eventually, like always, Yoshika just kind of pushed her feelings for Rena down. And before long, Yoshika was back to reading her book. For the next several weeks, Yoshika would see her brother, Takahiro, sitting up against the door to Rena's bedroom more often than usual, having these kind of hushed conversations through the door with Rena. Also, Yoshika began to notice that Takahiro was now cooking all of Rena's meals. Normally, their mother was the one who cooked Rena's food, but now Takahiro seemed to have taken over that task entirely. As for Yoshika, because she was primarily in charge of being the one to constantly clean the house, that meant she was the one going into Rena's bedroom and collecting her dirty dishes. And as soon as Takahiro had begun being the cook for Rena, Yoshika began to notice that more and more food was being left on Rena's plates. Basically, Rena wasn't eating as much food as she normally did, and this started to worry Yoshika. Rena was already a very small person. She was 4 foot 11 inches tall, barely 90 pounds. And Yoshika worried that, she really needs to eat. She's already so small. She can't afford to miss meals. And then one day in the middle of May, Yoshika went into Rena's bedroom and she saw all of her dishes were basically completely filled with the food she had been given. She basically had not touched them. And Yoshika, she really never actually spoke to Rena when she was in the bedroom. But this time she just couldn't help herself. And without even looking at Rena, Yoshika, she gathered up the plates full of food and she said, "Rena, you need to eat more of your food." Rena didn't say anything back. And Yoshika, she just quickly turned and walked out of the room. But after that interaction, Takahiro would tell Yoshika that Rena doesn't want you going in her room ever again. And so from now on, the dishes that you would normally collect, Rena will place them right outside of the door. That way, you don't have to go inside that room. Also, around the same time, Rena, who normally would only leave her bedroom to go use the bathroom, well, she began going to the bathroom exclusively at night when her family was asleep to avoid any interaction with them. And so by this point, Rena's interactions with her family were reduced to basically zero. By early August, Takahiro and Yoshika were being sent to the store more and more often by Rena to get more of these surgical spirits, the medical alcohol. Now, neither Takahiro nor Yoshika had any idea what Rina was doing with these surgical spirits, but they knew it was their duty to support her, and so they kept buying them, and what they would do is they would come back home with these bottles, and Takahiro would barely open Rina's door, and he would tuck the bottle inside, and then Rina would take it, the door would shut, and then Rina would never give them her empty bottle. Basically, the bottle went in, and it stayed inside. Then, on August 18th of 2018, Takahiro and Rina appeared to get in some kind of a fight. Yoshika was in the kitchen, and she saw that Takahiro was sitting against the door of Rina's bedroom, and the two were having kind of a hushed conversation. And then at some point, Takahiro stood up, and he turned around and faced the door and kind of yelled into it, "I told you your soul was not enough." And then Rina said something back to him, at which point Takahiro said, "No, please, please," as if he was kind of begging with Rina to change her mind. And then before Yoshika could come over and ask Takahiro what was going on, Takahiro just opened up Rina's bedroom door and walked inside, and suddenly the house went completely silent. Yoshika was too nervous to walk over and look inside of the room, and so she just stayed in the kitchen and listened. And for 15 minutes, it was absolute silence. And then Takahiro walked out of Rina's bedroom, shut the door behind him, and he looked very calm. And at this point, Yoshika looked over at him and said, "What's going on?" And Takahiro, he would just smile and tell Yoshika that Rina's masterwork is nearly completed. And then Takahiro asked Yoshika if she remembered when Rina had said, at some point her masterwork was going to require some direct help from the family, but she said, we'll know when the time is right for us to participate. And Yoshika would say, yes, I remember that. And Takahiro said, well, the time is now. Then Takahiro told Yoshika that they had to go to the store and get more surgical spirits. And so really without questioning him, Yoshika went with him. They went to the store and they would purchase 3 times the normal amount of surgical spirits that they normally would. And then when they got home, Takahiro alone would go into Rina's bedroom with these surgical spirits. He would shut the door behind him, and Yoshika just sat in the kitchen for about 10 minutes until Takahiro came out again, no longer carrying these surgical spirits. And he would come over to Yoshika and he would say, "Rina is ready to reconcile with you. She wants you to sit by the door and talk to her. And if you do that, you can be more involved in creating her masterwork." And at this news, Yoshika felt a mixture of frustration and relief. She had never thought it was fair that Rina had so completely cut her off after that 2013 simian line joke she made while palm reading. Also, Rina had made Yoshika's life so difficult for so long. I mean, Yoshika had basically been forced to give up her dreams of playing the piano, and she had to give up her friends and all of her life ambitions and goals to just support Rina. But despite all of that, deep down, Yoshika missed Rina terribly. They did used to be so close. She wanted to have that relationship again. And so Yoshika walked over to Rina's closed bedroom door. She sat down against it, and at first, she didn't say anything, and Rina didn't say anything either. But then at some point, it was like the floodgates just opened, and Yoshika kind of began pouring her heart out about how sad she was, about how her and Rina's relationship had really gone south and how she wanted to fix it. And now normally, on the rare times that Yoshika would talk through the door to Rina, like when she was trying to open it up to drop something off or whatever it was, oftentimes Rina would just start banging on something inside of the room, kind of to tell Yoshika to stop talking and go away. But as Yoshika sat there pouring her heart out to Rina through the door, the one thing Yoshika noticed was there was no pounding coming from inside the room. Rina was listening to her. And then the next day, after Yoshika and Takahiro had gone to the store again and gotten more surgical spirits and brought them back to the house, instead of just Takahiro being allowed to enter Rina's bedroom, this time Yoshika was allowed to join. And so Takahiro and Yoshika, they went into the dark bedroom and Rina was laying on the bed, and they walked over to her and Takahiro showed Yoshika what they needed to do. It was the last step of this masterwork project that Rina was working on. They basically needed to rub these surgical spirits all over Rina's body. Now, Yoshika didn't really understand why they were doing this, but she respected that this was part of Rina's plan, and frankly, Yoshika was just happy to be included in creating this masterwork, and so she didn't really ask any questions. And so after the brother and sister had rubbed this alcohol all over Rina for about 10 minutes, they walked back outside, they shut the door, and then Yoshika, she stayed back and sat down against the door and kind of poured her heart out again to Rina. And it was just very therapeutic. And in many ways, this was the first time that Yoshika was feeling happy again. I mean, she was finally starting to repair this relationship with Rina. And so over the next several weeks, this became Yoshika's new daily routine. Her and her brother would get all these surgical spirits, they'd come home, they'd rub them all over Rina, and then over the course of the day, Yoshika would stop by the door and chat with Rina through it, and that was it. And then on September 25th, 2018, after Yoshika and Takahiro had applied these surgical spirits to Rina's body, Yoshika told Rina that she had a very special surprise for her. Yoshika was in a really good mood this day because one, she was feeling really good about her new relationship with her sister, but also two, when she had gone to the pharmacy earlier with her brother, normally they didn't have any interaction with the pharmacist who sold the surgical spirits. Mostly because Yoshika and her brother did their best to kind of like hide themselves and make it very clear they were not looking to talk. But on this particular day, the pharmacist had been very talkative and was trying to talk to Yoshika, and Yoshika, she decided she would talk back. Now, their conversation was not very substantive. Basically, the pharmacist finally had asked Yoshika, why are you buying all these surgical spirits? And Yoshika would say, oh, they're for my sister Rina, and, she needs more and more of them every day, and, she's working on something special, and we don't really know what it is, but this is part of it, and we know whatever she's doing, it's going to be worth it. And so even though this conversation seems kind of meaningless, for Yoshika, who had virtually no contact with other people, it was great having that little talk. And so when she came home, she just felt ready to do something special for Rina. And so after Yoshika and Takahiro had left Rina's bedroom after applying these surgical spirits, Yoshika went to go give Rina her surprise. And so Yoshika, she walked over to the family piano that was not far from Rina's bedroom door. And Yoshika, she was nervous, but she sat down on the bench and she opened up the lid and she placed her fingers on the keys. Yoshika's big surprise was she was going to play a song called The Waltz of the Flowers, which is a famous piece of classical music that was inspired by the composer's love for his sister. And so Yoshika thought this was the perfect song to finally play in this house for Rina. She'll see that I love her so much. And so Yoshika, she began to play the song, and as she did, she was constantly listening to see if Rina would start banging on something to tell Yoshika to stop. But again, she didn't. It was quiet, and so Yoshika, she played this beautiful song, and then when it was all over, again, Yoshika's listening carefully for Rina to yell out or be mad that she's playing this loud music in the house, but it was just quiet. And so again, Yoshika just felt this closeness to her sister, and before long, Yoshika felt tears of happiness coming down her cheeks. But then, as Yoshika closed the lid of the piano, she did hear a banging, but it wasn't coming from Rina's bedroom, it was coming from the front door. And then a moment later, Yoshika heard someone scream from outside the front door, "Police, open up!" But before Yoshika could go to the door to open it, her mother had ran to the door. She opened all 4 locks, but then only opened it a crack and tried to yell at the police to go away, go away. But the police, they were kind of pushing on the door, trying to get the mother to get out of the way. And Yoshika, she kind of moved over and looked through the crack. And she saw it wasn't just a couple of police officers. It was a whole army of police officers and firefighters and EMTs. There was an ambulance. And then before long, the police officer that had been yelling, open up, he finally just pushed and got the door open all the way. And then a swarm of people in uniforms flooded the home. And as soon as all these officers were in the house, they immediately began opening up every door like they were looking for something. And then finally they got to Rina's bedroom and they opened the door. And as soon as they did, Yoshika watched as the officers just stopped at the doorway and they began cussing and yelling and turning their faces away. And then the officers went into Rina's bedroom, and then a minute later, they began talking on their radio, and then EMTs came into the house with a stretcher. They went into Rina's bedroom, and then before long, Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother watched as the stretcher came out again with these officers and EMTs, and on the stretcher was Rina, and she looked terrible. Her eyes were sunken back in her head, and her skin was so pale it was practically see-through. I mean, really, she just kind of looked like a skeleton. The real story of what happened inside of that family's home would quickly become international news. And not because Rina was secretly creating a masterwork of art in her bedroom. Here's what really happened. Rina stopped eating food in April of 2018. She would say that the only thing she needed to be nourished was her visionary soul. And so basically, because she had this visionary soul, she didn't need food. That was the conversation that Yoshika had overheard between Takahiro and Rina when Takahiro was saying, "Only your soul? How? Well, he was trying to figure out how Rina was going to survive by being nourished by her soul. It didn't make any sense. Fast forward 4 months to August 18th, and again, Yoshika had overheard her brother and her sister talking through the bedroom door, except on this day, it sounded like Takahiro was fighting with Rina, because at some point he had stood up and yelled through the door, "I told you your soul wasn't enough!" And then he had busted inside of Rina's bedroom and stayed in there in silence for 15 minutes, only to come back out again and very calmly tell Yoshika that, "Don't worry, Rina is nearing the end of her master work, and we just need to go out and get her more surgical spirits." Well, it would turn out the reason Takahiro was mad and yelled through the door at Rina is because he was trying to talk to her through the door and she wasn't talking back. And he suspected it was because she wasn't eating, and so he had yelled at her about that, and then barged into her room, only to find Rina totally unresponsive, not moving, not talking, nothing. And so he just stood there wondering what to do. And so as Takahiro is standing there, it clicks for him that now is the time. Now's the time to get involved. And so Takahiro left the bedroom, he grabbed Yoshika, they went to the pharmacy, they got more surgical spirits, they came back, and Takahiro alone went into Rina's bedroom and covered her head to toe in these spirits, because that was something she had wanted him to do before, and he believed that that's what she needed right now, because she can't talk, she can't move, she needs more of these spirits. That's going to help her visionary soul nourish her while she completes this master work. And for the next month, Takahiro and Yoshika would continue to apply these spirits to Rina's body, believing they were helping her complete her master work. On September 25th, when Yoshika and Takahiro were at the pharmacy getting more spirits, the reason this pharmacist finally struck up a conversation with Yoshika is because over time, the pharmacist had noticed that every time they came in to buy these surgical spirits, they smelled so bad. And on this particular day, when they came in, the stench was just overwhelming. And so the pharmacist finally had asked Yoshika, what are these surgical spirits for? And Yoshika would give this totally weird answer about how the spirits were for her sister and she was working on this master work in her bedroom and it was all going to be worth it. And so when Yoshika and Takahiro had left that day, the pharmacist was just so weirded out and alarmed by them that he called the police. And when the police arrived at the family's home, they discovered that Rina was not building a masterwork in her bedroom, she was just dead in her bed, and had been for 6 weeks. Rina died around August 18th, which is the day that Takahiro came into the room and discovered her unresponsive, which meant there was never any reconciliation happening between Yoshika and Rina. It's unclear why Takahiro had told Yoshika, hey, Rina's ready to reconcile with you, because again, Rina was dead at the time, so there's no way she would have said anything to him. And so when Yoshika was having these supposed heart-to-hearts through the door with her sister or playing music for her, that wasn't real. The only real thing that was happening is Yoshika and Takahiro, from August 18th until the end of September when the police busted into their home, they would spend nearly every day rubbing this weird medical alcohol all over their dead sister's body because that's what they believed she wanted, when in reality, all this alcohol was doing was actually mummifying her body. Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother were all charged with preventing a proper and decent burial. As for Rina, her cause of death could not actually be determined, but based on what she looked like, they assumed she died from starvation. The court would eventually drop the charges against the family, saying that basically the family was too mentally ill to stand trial. And this was because the court had discovered that Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother actually had not accepted that Rina was dead. They believed she was actually still alive, that all the work they had done rubbing those spirits on her had nourished her soul, and she was still working on this master work. And as of a few years ago, the family is still living in that same cottage, and it's not clear if they ever actually came to understand that Rina was in fact dead.
Never cut its drum, oh let its song carry you. like a crab beside me. Its stem is so strong, seeing off the last of its days. I love the sound that its leaves make. Hey, paddle-hearted girl, sway like bamboo with me. Never cut its trunk, oh, let its song carry you. Oh, will you warp like a fish? Let my back, let me die by the sea.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mr. Ballin Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just